Well, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished historians, Cordia, I'd like to offer my warmest thanks to Professor Eugenio Biagini and all in the Modern Irish History Group who've invited me to speak today. Also a very warm thanks to Niamh for that lovely rendition on the fiddle of that wonderful Irish traditional tune. I am kind of slightly worried that after that very nice and lively opening, the rest of the proceedings here might seem rather dull in comparison. I was thinking also that it must be a great advantage to a lecturer in history to have the fiddle on on standby. You can look at your audience if they're beginning to drift off at any moment and they're kind of losing attention. Just whip out the fiddle, play a tune, get them to re-engage, and off you go again. But in any event. Also, my particular thanks to our hosts in St. Catharine's College, and let me congratulate you on the forthcoming 545th anniversary of the college, which was founded on the 25th of November 1473. I recall from my own time as a history student, it seems like a century ago, at Trinity College in Dublin, that the late 15th century was regarded by historians as a seminal time of change, as the medieval period transitioned to the early modern. And there's certainly no doubt that the transformative period we are now living through will be one to be discussed and debated by historians for years to come. As familiar political and economic paradigms seem to fray at the edges, we're all struggling to understand and make sense of these confusing times. Brian Friel's wonderful play Translations deals with such a moment of confusion and collision in Irish-British relations on the eve of the Great Famine. And struggling to make some sense of this disorienting experience, the main character, who combines classical erudition with great fondness for the drink, despairingly pleads, "Confusion is not an ignoble condition." Since coming to London, and as I have grappled with the complexities and contentions of Brexit, I've often thought of and indeed been consoled by these eloquent words of Friel: "Confusion is not an ignoble condition." A further consoling thought is that an Irish ambassador, 545 years from now, might be speaking in St. Catharine's about the Brexit years, coherently explaining the causal factors at play and satisfactorily noting their thankfully brief impact on the long and friendly history of British-Irish relations. In these imaginary remarks, such an ambassador might start his explanations, or indeed her explanations, with the words of the authors of 1066 and All That, when they wryly commented that Gladstone, quote, "spent his declining years trying to guess the answer to the Irish question. Unfortunately, whenever he was getting warm, the Irish secretly changed the question." Some 124 years after Gladstone's tenure as Prime Minister, perhaps some of those of us involved in Irish-UK relations might be forgiven for feeling that the situation has reversed. Indeed, a few months after the Brexit referendum, the commentator and writer Fintan O'Toole rather sagely observed that Britain's Irish question has become Ireland's English question. The essential truth, of course, is that the histories of our two islands have always been and will continue to be closely connected, intertwined and interdependent. Ireland and Britain live in the shadow as well as the shelter of one another. And the reference to shadow is not intended to be a negative statement. It's simply a fact on the ground, a result of our proximate geography and our entwined demography. Some of us living on this island, some across the water, some Irish, some British, some both. Different and ever-changing identities and perspectives, shaped by the interplay of history, geography, and culture. Oscar Wilde wrote that the proper basis for marriage is mutual misunderstanding. If that is the case, Ireland and Britain are indeed long-standing married partners. even if the degree of our mutual happiness may have waxed and waned over the years. In any event, that mutual misunderstanding, which is also at the heart of Brian Friel's translations, provides endless scope for historical and wider academic study. And I know that will be a consolation for many people in the room. I want to focus on the more recent past today because I believe that it holds the key to understanding the current complexities of the Irish-British relationship in the present. Despite the confusions and mutual misunderstandings of the past, I think there is a broad consensus that the relationship between these islands has been transformed for the better in the past few decades. I believe that historians have played a key enabling role in that transformation. Through diligent research and rigorous scholarship, they have challenged traditional and lazy narratives. They have presented fresh and inevitably complex perspectives on Irish history and British history, and in doing so, they have provoked us to reflect anew on the essence of Irish and British identity. A fine example of that scholarship is the recently published 4-volume Cambridge History of Ireland, which the Embassy was delighted to launch in London in June. And I know there was a separate launch here in Cambridge, and indeed one in Dublin, I think, which was presided over by President Higgins, and one very recently in Washington. So the Cambridge history has certainly been doing the rounds. One of the great achievements of historians in recent years, and reflected in those volumes, is to have argued so persuasively that the histories of these islands, when presented solely as narratives that chart the progress and formation of demarcated nations, are often insufficient and fundamentally inadequate. At secondary school in the early 1970s, learning about the 1916 Rising and the subsequent radicalization of the independence movement, I didn't hear anything about the concurrent conflict in the continent of Europe. It was as if World War I was taking place in another galaxy. We now know that the Rising and its aftermath cannot be properly understood without taking account of the brutalizing impact of the European war and the subsequent demobilization of thousands of battle-hardened men who returned to Ireland. It was therefore the interplay of developments between our respective countries that was often the driver of seismic historic change. This interplay of political and security dynamics between Britain and Ireland has spanned the centuries. From the attempts by the Yorkist pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck to use Ireland as a base to attempt to topple Henry VII in the late 1400s, to the conflict 150 years later between Charles I and Parliament, to the Williamite Wars another 50 years on, to the French invasion of Ireland in the late 18th century, which hastened the Act of Union, and to Bonner Law playing the Ulster card in the Home Rule crisis in 1912. The history of our two islands and their peoples so often entwine that any accurate perspective requires the use of a wide-angle lens. Iris Murdoch, the great Irish writer, British writer, Oxford student, Cambridge student, wrote in The Sea that, quote, "In my experience, a good row not only does not clear the air, but can land you with a lifelong enemy." As listed above, Ireland and Britain have had their fair share of rows. None of these cleared the air at the time, and many lifelong enemies were indeed often made. And to those weighed down by Brexit and the current political vacuum in Northern Ireland, who say that relations between our two islands have never been worse, well, maybe we should apply them or invite them to apply some modest historical perspective. However, our past political interactions have not been solely a source of strife and conflict. We should not forget, for instance, the honoured place of Daniel O'Connell in the history of modern democracy in these islands. He stood up for freedom of religion and separation of church and state, as well as taking a strong stance against slavery, when these positions were outside the mainstream of contemporary political debate. I hope I will not make him blush when I am going to refer to Eugenio's masterly British Democracy and Irish Nationalism, in which he argues that Ireland was a key factor in the crafting of a new politics of humanitarian and moral concern in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Many progressive groups saw their cause echoed in the arguments for Home Rule. As a result, broader questions of liberty and citizenship became more prominent in political discourse. And over a century later, I would like to think that the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 has had and will continue to have a similar effect in reaffirming the importance of human rights and respect for the plurality of identity in the political discourse of these islands. Excuse me. A month tomorrow, on the 11th of November, we will mark the centenary of Armistice Day. Finally, a century ago, after four long years of terrible suffering, that conflict which had engulfed the world and resulted in the deaths of millions drew to a close. During November, people across these islands and throughout Europe will pause and remember all those who lost their lives. Along with other diplomatic colleagues, on Remembrance Sunday, I will have the honour of laying a wreath on behalf of Ireland at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. On the island of Ireland, the men of the 36th Division, the 10th Division, the 16th Division in particular, will be in the thoughts of many families. We will remember too those who survived and who returned home to an Ireland that had begun to change profoundly in their absence. The change was so profound that on return, their service in British uniform was an inconvenient fact to be quickly erased. For decades, the stories of these men were largely airbrushed from Irish history. Thankfully, that erasure is now being addressed. Barker, Buckley, Clark, Griffiths, Ross, White. These are just a few of the names on the War Memorial here in St. Catherine's. To stand before these memorials and read the long lists of names is a sobering reminder of the devastating impact of conflict on the lives of so many, and of the loss to society of such talent and potential. And those names are also striking to an Irish eye because so many of them are familiar. Surnames that could, and probably do, appear on First World War memorials all over Ireland. The twists of our sometimes shared and sometimes overlapping history bring up curious coincidences. Coincidences that underline the importance of understanding our history in all its complexity. For instance, two of the men listed on a war memorial here in St. Catherine's College share surnames with two of Ireland's most famous revolutionaries, Clark and Griffiths, leaders of the 1916 Rising. I mention this coincidence as it is emblematic of the overlapping history between our two islands and of the need to keep interrogating that history. Whether we like it or not, we live in the shadow of the history that has shaped each of us, individuals and nations alike. Historical amnesia is not a wise choice. If we tried it, others would present false narratives designed to support malign agendas. We must remember, and despite the default settings of mutual misunderstanding, keep trying to understand both the common and the different experiences that shape our identities and perspectives. As the 19th century Irish novelist Maria Edgeworth wrote, "Surely it is more generous to forgive and remember than to forgive and forget." Since 2012, Ireland has moved through commemorating the centenaries of a momentous decade in our history, and one that profoundly shaped Irish life in the century that followed. The Home Rule crisis and Ulster Covenant in 1912, the start of the First World War in 1914, the Easter Rising of 1916, and now to Armistice, and we look ahead to the centenary of the commencement of the War of Irish Independence in 1919, the partition of the island, and the Civil War that followed. Elizabeth Bowen wrote, "I could wish that the English kept history in mind more and that the Irish kept it in mind less." I cannot speak to the English part of this, but I can assure you that the evidence of this decade of commemorations would suggest that the Irish are still keeping history in mind. And thanks to the wise counsel of historians, we're doing so in a very different way to the sole narrative of Ireland being a victim of 800 years of oppression. That was largely presented to me as a child and a student. It has been so far a decade of reflection and of remembrance, motivated by a deep respect for the tragedies endured and a strong desire to better understand the forces that shaped events and individual lives. Economic, military, social, political forces all played their part in that fateful decade a century ago, and we've tried to remember the pivotal moments in ways that further our understanding of each other. The more we reflected on the significance of these events, the more complex the perspective became. And that complexity is our friend, since it prevents glib stereotyping and excluding narratives being used to perpetuate old resentments and inherited animosities. This work on commemorating our past is in a more inclusive way, stretches back a number of years, and in many ways traces in parallel the evolution of the peace process in Northern Ireland and the changing nature of British-Irish relations. A century ago, Tom Kettle, a European, an Irish nationalist MP, and a British soldier who died in the war, saw the need for something greater to come out of the horror and loss of life in the First World War. He wrote as follows: "This tragedy of Europe may be and must be the prologue to the two reconciliations of which all statesmen have dreamed: the reconciliation of Protestant Ulster with Ireland and the reconciliation of Ireland with Great Britain." It will be 20 years in November since Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and then President Mary McAleese stood together in Messines in Belgium to open the Island of Ireland Peace Park, itself a cross-border, cross-community initiative to build friendships on the island. The park was built in a spirit of reconciliation to honour the memory of all those from the 16th and the 36th Divisions, men from very different political persuasions and with varying motivations, but who all found themselves fighting side by side in common purpose. And 19 years later, on the centenary of the Battle of Messines, on the 7th of June 2017, the first truly joint Ireland-UK commemoration took place in the same park. Teams from the Northern Ireland Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the UK Department of Culture, Media and Sport, as well as our Department of the Taoiseach in Ireland and my own Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, all worked together to plan a ceremony that would remember the terrible events in Messines a century ago. The then Taoiseach Enda Kenny, His Royal Highness Prince William, Princess Astrid of Belgium, Irish and British ministers, and representatives from all the Northern Ireland parties were present, together with men and women from all parts of these islands. And all there, from many different political persuasions, stood together in silence and solidarity while the Irish and British anthems were played in a Belgian field. In moments like that, we stand in the shelter of one another, shielded from the shadows of the past and indeed the shadows of the present. The Messines commemorations were also symbolic recognitions of the ongoing task of reconciliation and solemn tributes to that healing vision of Tom Kettle. Such respectful commemorations also open up a space for the complexity of our shared history to be recognised by both governments, by political parties and by communities. In the context of Northern Ireland and the troubled recent past, this open exploration is both vital and healing. In the words of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth during her state visit to Ireland in 2011, it is about finding ways to be, quote, able to bow to the past, but not be bound by it. One of the great privileges of life as a diplomat is the inside view on historical events to which we are sometimes witness. For any envious historians, I would note, however, that there are also moments when you might wish that your front row seat was not quite so close to the action, and that the events in question were perhaps already history. Nevertheless, I have been lucky enough to be involved with two of the most important moments in the recent history of Irish-UK relations. The reciprocal state visits by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth to Ireland in 2011 and by President Higgins to the UK in 2014. In 2011, I was working in Áras which is our official residence of the President of Ireland, as Secretary General to President McAleese. The idea of a visit by Queen Elizabeth had been discussed from the very early days of President McAleese taking office in 1997. It took several years and painstaking diplomatic work to arrive at the point where the visit was ready to proceed. Over the previous decade, President McAleese and the Queen had met several times, and on each occasion the desirability of such a visit had been discussed and agreed between them. It was their shared personal determination, as well as the positive evolution of the peace process, and of course the support of both governments, that ensured the state visit to Ireland took place in 2011. There were many memorable moments during that visit. The enthusiasm of the crowds in Cork, which ironically Cork, as some of you may well as known, is in Ireland, its nickname is the Rebel County, but that didn't kind of limit their enthusiasm for the Queen when she arrived there. The Queen's obvious delight in the happy banter at the English market, the warmth with which she was received by the Gaelic Athletic Association in their headquarters in Croke Park, and of course Croke Park was the site of the first Bloody Sunday during the War of Independence. All of these were very memorable moments, but for me in particular, two stood out. In a still moving gesture of reconciliation, the Queen's visit to the Garden of Remembrance and her bow as she laid a wreath was the essence of the transformative power of a respectful and generous gesture. I think all those watching that day at home and abroad caught and held their breath for a moment. It was the literal embodiment of her words, to bow to the past and not to be bound by it. And later that day, another gesture of respect and friendship, conveyed by a few simple words in Irish. The President opened her speech in Dublin Castle with those words, "A Uachtaráin agus a Córide," President and friends. And these, opening those words, particularly in the Irish language, symbolised the depth of change in the relationship between our countries and peoples. In 2014, President Higgins' reciprocal visit to the UK represented a further step change in the relationship. He spoke about the mutuality of relationships, quoting an old Irish saying, which in Irish is "Ar sca a céile a warrimid." Now, Irish speakers or keen observers of state visits among you will know that phrase. It is often translated as "we live in the shadow of one another." It also has a more open and generous meaning, one referred to in the title of this speech. We live in the shelter of one another. And when I think back on that visit, and indeed the subsequent deeply moving visit by Their Royal Highnesses Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall to Sligo in 2015, or the visit this summer of Their Royal Highnesses the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to Dublin, or of Irish ministers who visit the UK on almost a weekly basis, and the warmth and welcome for each of these visits. When I think of all of that, it is clear to me that shelter and solidarity have taken the place of the shadow and strife of the past. I should note in passing that Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall have now visited Ireland for 4 successive years. The visit to Sligo, and in particular to Mullaghmore, the site of the murder of the Prince's godfather, Lord Mountbatten, in 1979, attracted considerable media attention. But there have been 3 annual visits since then, low profile in media terms, but each attesting to the deep commitment of Prince Charles to continuing the work of reconciliation and friendship begun by Her Majesty in 2011. And that commitment by their Royal Highnesses, and indeed by the royal family more generally, is deeply appreciated by the Irish government. Now, a major catalyst for the normalisation of relations between our two neighbouring countries was, of course, the Good Friday Agreement, achieved 20 years ago last April. A young Derry woman speaking at an event in London very recently described the news of the signing of the agreement as, quote, a little bit of a miracle. Her words were heartfelt and expressed a feeling shared by so many people across these islands on the 10th of April, 1998. It is not often, if ever, any of us get close to even a bit of a miracle, let alone share in one. But for many of the people of these islands, the achievement of the Good Friday Agreement genuinely felt like that. At the time, I was working as a press officer at the Embassy of Ireland in Washington, DC. I vividly recall that as the Easter weekend approached, I was persistently ringing my colleagues in Castle Buildings in Stormont, seeking updates. The news was constantly changing, as encouraging prospects for agreement were quickly followed by fears that one or other of the parties was on the brink of walking out. The pendulum swung fearfully from optimism to pessimism and back again until at last, on a cold and snowy Good Friday afternoon, Senator Mitchell declared that agreement had been reached. Among the participants in Belfast, I suspect the dominant reaction was one of relief and exhaustion. In Washington, DC, it was one of elation. Among my colleagues in the embassy, across the Irish community, and within the White House itself, where President Clinton had been working the phones over the previous few days, encouraging the political parties to stretch themselves and reach agreement. It didn't, of course, happen overnight. It took decades of work by advocates of peace like John Hume, and it took courage, determination, and generosity by the political parties to take risks for peace. Most fundamentally, I believe it was the evolving partnership between the Irish and UK governments which was one of the key drivers of progress. A partnership that gradually developed a common analysis of the nature of the political problem in Northern Ireland, a partnership that provided the prevailing strategy in pressing for an agreed solution to the problem, a partnership that sustained the determined efforts on the good days and on the bad days to press ahead with the negotiation and implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. While Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern have rightfully been credited with their key parts in this achievement, their predecessors also played important enabling roles. Sir John Major, as well as John Bruton and the late Albert Reynolds. Much has been written about the role played by common EU membership of Ireland and the UK to the ultimate achievement of the Good Friday Agreement and the success of the peace process. The fact of the matter is that Ireland and the UK were partners in Europe before we were partners in Northern Ireland. Our common membership of the then European community from 1973 was a key factor in the growing friendship and trust between London and Dublin. It facilitated the building of relationships between officials, contacts between ministers, and the forging of alliances around issues of common interest. It is, for instance, no coincidence that it was John Major and Albert Reynolds as Taoiseach who presided over the groundbreaking Downing Street Declaration 25 years ago this December. Major and Reynolds knew each other well from attending meetings of European finance ministers when John Major was Chancellor of the Exchequer and Albert Reynolds was Ireland's Minister for Finance. When both were elevated to the Premiership, their relationship was already built on friendship and mutual respect, and they could then hit the ground running on Northern Ireland. I would contend, therefore, that common EU membership and the delivery of the Good Friday Agreement, which also liberated both countries to normalise bilateral relations, I think these two factors have had a benignly transformative effect. Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. Make sure that the planks won't slip at busy points. Secure all ladders, tighten belted joints. And yet all this comes down when the job's done, showing off walls of sure and solid stone. Ireland and the UK have to trust in each other, trust in the durability of our relationship despite challenging circumstances, and find new ways, and perhaps even new scaffolding, to capture and conserve the best of what has worked well in the recent past. We're neighbours and friends. Our people move freely between our two countries. In fact, London-Dublin is the busiest air corridor in Europe and the second busiest in the world. And we share so much history, heritage, sport, and culture. We also share a vital responsibility. The Irish and British governments are the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, the bedrock for the peace process on the island of Ireland. Fans of Star Wars might describe the agreement as the Force. Extending the analogy, Brexit represents a disturbance to that benign force. The UK's decision to leave the European Union is clearly a significant change to the status quo. It cannot but alter the dynamics between Ireland and the UK and on the island of Ireland. As with any major change, it undoubtedly has the potential to affect the already fragile and complex situation in Northern Ireland and the ongoing and essential implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. The challenge of managing the fallout of Brexit has also been compounded by the absence of functioning devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. The current political vacuum in Stormont is deeply worrying. If partnership politics is stalled, and if parties are perceived to have walked away from power sharing, community relations on the ground will suffer, and the long-term project of reconciliation will regress. In addition, the abeyance of a Northern Ireland executive has meant that there is no coherent and constructive mechanism to channel the collective views of Northern Ireland into the UK and political and policy-making process on Brexit. In its absence, individual parties have sought to assert their distinctive and inevitably more partisan views, to the detriment of a wider consensus that might have been possible if the Stormont institutions were operational. We should be in no doubt that the prospect of Brexit, especially a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, is causing genuine anxiety in Northern Ireland, the border counties in the south, and indeed the island more generally. And the anxieties are not about the administrative complexities of achieving frictionless trade. They are about the disturbance of people's lives and livelihoods. They are about a fear of regression to the disturbed past. If there's anyone here who hasn't watched the poetic short video produced recently by the Financial Times about the Irish border, it's about 8 minutes long. I think you can just get it on YouTube very easily. Then I highly recommend it. In it, the actor Stephen Ray reads a long-form poem by a Northern Ireland poet and playwright, Claire Dwyer Hogg, in which he refers to, and a few lines, I just want to quote them, but he refers to the political debates on the issue here in Britain as, quote, struggling to grasp the ungrabbable. He describes the current open and invisible border as roads that start here and end there, somehow allowing a wound to heal. He characterises the transformation along the border wrought by the Good Friday Agreement as the spirit of peace in the normality. Nothing outward as such, no extra levity, just a gentleness in the mundanity. And he arrestingly captures the current fears and anxieties when he solemnly states, "We live here, and some of us are holding our breath." In addressing the challenge of Brexit, the goal of both Ireland and the EU27 has been to simply conserve what we have enjoyed for the last 20 years. An evolving peace process, a Good Friday Agreement that has transformed life for the better, and an open and invisible border that is both a cause and a manifestation of that transformation. Nothing more, nothing less. And for the Irish government, there are no constitutional implications or agendas at play here. Indeed, the Irish government has been very careful to keep separate the immediate tasks of managing the fallout from Brexit and the long-term constitutional destiny of Northern Ireland. The latter will continue to be governed by the principle of consent set out in the agreement. Conflating both issues only serves to unhelpfully heighten political temperatures at a very sensitive time. We know that the UK government shares the objective of avoiding a hard border on the island. In this respect, we very much welcome the commitment made by Prime Minister May last December, and again in March of this year, to a workable, durable and legally enforceable backstop solution in the withdrawal agreement to ensure that a hard border will never happen. In the final phase of the Brexit negotiations, and thankfully I hope we're there, these were always going to be a bumpy few weeks. As we meet this evening, the negotiators from the UK and the Commission Task Force representing the EU 27 are intensively engaged in trying to bridge the gaps between their respective positions on the withdrawal agreement, which includes the protocol relating to Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the accompanying political declaration on the framework for the future relationship between the EU and the UK. While there are substantial gaps to be bridged, there is also goodwill and momentum to achieve significant progress in advance of next week's meeting of the European Council. I don't minimise the challenges of reaching an agreement between the UK and the EU. However, 35 years as a diplomat has taught me that we must always maintain the duty of hope. And building on over 3 decades of growing understanding, courage and leadership, I am confident that our respective governments' mutual commitment to peace and prosperity on the island of Ireland and to harmonious Ireland-UK bilateral relations will also be an important compass in charting us through these testing times. As John Hume said, when people are divided, the only solution is agreement. It is in that spirit that we will need to meet the challenges of the weeks and months ahead, both on Brexit and on the now 21-month long absence of a power-sharing executive and assembly in Northern Ireland. And once we get to the future relationship phase of the Brexit negotiations, Ireland will work hard for as close as possible an EU-UK relationship, not least in trading terms, where the trade and business relationship supports thousands of jobs on both sides of the Irish Sea. It might be worth mentioning that Ireland is the UK's 6th largest export market, and that last year the UK exported 10 billion worth more to Ireland than it did to China. So that these relationships are very important. And the closer we can make a future EU-UK relationship, the easier it will be to sustain a close and friendly bilateral relationship between Ireland and Britain. We are more than the sum of our challenges too. Our Irish-British story also comprises the immense connectivity of all the people living on these islands, who interact with each other and cherish our mutually enriching relationship. It includes the thousands of businessmen and women who are the sinews of trade and commerce across the Irish Sea, our shared appreciation for the wonders of the English language and our talented writers and actors who give expression to it, our musicians and artists who reach past all our borders, as Niamh did this evening, our academics who illuminate the world for everyone and challenge us to think. All these strands are part of a rich tapestry of the deep, wide and complex relationship that binds our two countries together. Sometimes as a small country beside a larger neighbour, Ireland can feel as if it is the only one living in a shadow. And yet, time and time again, for centuries now, an Irish question or an Irish dimension has been at the heart of British politics. Again and again, the contentions and controversies of the politics of one of our countries becomes caught up in the other. We've weathered rather a lot together over the centuries. We're used to storms in the most western, most westerly of these islands, we have a certain historical understanding about dealing with political events which catch everyone by surprise by the degree of their fervour and intensity. Brexit is the most recent instalment of this ever-changing and dynamic relationship. We cannot rely entirely on the warmth and comfort of recent decades to safeguard Ireland-UK relations. Proactive management by our two governments will be required to ensure that the structures and processes of Irish-British relations are fit for purpose in a post-Brexit landscape. Some new scaffolding may indeed be needed. But we can also go forward in the knowledge that we have both weathered storms in the past, and despite the turbulence, given shelter to one another. When the rain and the mist clear, Britain and Ireland will still be close neighbours, and our people will still be good friends. In concluding, I'd like to quote a few lines from the poet Derek Mahan. The sun rises in spite of everything, and the far cities are beautiful and bright. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the day break and the clouds flying. Everything is going to be all right. Despite the shadow of Brexit, I continue to believe that the UK and Ireland live in the shelter of one another. Thank you.